Hello and welcome to IBA's P2F webinar. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Melissa Wybrow and I'm joined by Phil Seymour, IBA's CEO, and Jonathan McDonald, Head Analyst for Commercial and Aging Aircraft. Today's session will be a fireside chat with Jono and Phil reviewing performance in the P2F market, demand for conversions, midlife options, the active fleet, and an update on the A320-321 conversion programme. If you have any questions, you can drop us a line using the question pane on the control panel. We do encourage it. It makes for an interesting discussion at the end. Just for information, we are also recording today's session, so we will be sending out a copy of the slides and the recording, potentially later on this evening or tomorrow. Okay, Jono and Phil, I'll pass over to you to get started.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, Phil Seymour here, CEO. I'm really just going to introduce Jono and the session we've got ready for you today. We've got 25 slides and we're going to do the market overview, growth forecast, a bit of a case study on options for conversion or part out for the older aircraft, looking at the active fleet, and an update on the A320-321 P2F program that we've been looking at that's going to be offered by CQ'd. So I'll pass you over to Jono to progress the session.
Thank you very much, Phil, and hello, good afternoon or good morning to everybody wherever you are. I think the first thing we'll start off with is just to sort of set the picture with traffic levels or freight traffic levels. As of recent, despite the general sort of buoyancy with e-commerce and the large amount of 767s being converted to freighters over the last few years, we've seen a little bit of a contraction or decline, certainly if you measure it by FTK's freight ton kilometers. However, one sort of change, if you like, in fortunes or encouragement is if you look at the IATA statistics, the FTKs for March 2019 actually increased very slightly compared to the same period in 2018. 0.1%, okay, it's a very, very marginal increase, but nevertheless, it's an increase in its own right. And this certainly represents a distinct improvement over February's figures, which showed a 4.9% decline. System-wide freight capacity, so that's the available freight ton kilometers, they were up by about 3% compared to March 2018, suggesting that there may have been a little bit of capacity growth outstripping demand there. Of course, as is ever, the cargo sector itself, or the air cargo sector itself, continues to face significant challenges, such as the global trade volumes, which declined by a percentage point over the past year, as well as general global economic activity, which has reduced, and the weakening of some consumer confidence. Despite this weaker manufacturing conditions for German exporters, and of course that dreaded taboo B word here in the UK, March 2019's performance does at least point to some degree of improvement, positivity, chippiness, however you want to call it. So I've got a summary of the figures there. You can see that these are March 19 figures compared to March 18 figures. The FTK increases are quite marked for most regions. But there is a little bit of a contraction, as you can see there, on percentage terms in the all crucial Asia Pacific region. So moving on to the important drivers, we're aware that based upon the 2019 Singapore World Cargo Symposium, the general feel there was that the 12-month growth projection for FTKs was set at about 2%, which is quite a modest level of growth, but it's at least a growth in itself. The feeling generally that we pick up in the industry is that it is a resilient industry. and it also takes a sort of halo effect from the passenger sector, where you're seeing still levels of growth at 6 to 7%. And I guess it's quite a mature trend now, but it's still very much an occurrence. The growth of the more affluent middle classes in countries like China and Southeast Asia generally, combined with unemployment reductions in the US, are positive factors towards the freight industry, thus enhancing people's buying trends. We did see a little bit of a reduction in the China, in air cargo on the China-US trade lane, for want of a better word, with both countries introducing their trade barriers during 2018. Ironically, that actually brought a slight increase or a slight boom in demand while people rushed to get goods shipped prior to all these hikes coming in. So moving on to the current fleet size now, that's dominated in the narrow body sector very much by the 737 classics still, 737-300s and 400s. And of course the 757, which is still very much the dominant player there. I think it's probably the most popular freighter ever made now, or in terms of conversions and the factory delivered aircraft, actually surpassing the 727-200, which in its day was the most popular. Moving on to the sort of medium-sized wide bodies, the predominant player there is obviously, unsurprisingly, the 767-300 ER, both as in terms of converted freighter and the factory delivered freighter, but also the A300-600 deserves a lot of mention there. Basically a fleet just nigh on 180 aircraft active, mainly with UPS and FedEx, but nevertheless a real sort of contributor to that fleet, if you like. It's nice to welcome on board to that fleet the A330-200 P2F. But yeah, it's nice to welcome the A330-200 P2F, 2 examples in service with Egypt Air. So it's nice to get those on board, and a small fleet of A330-300 P2Fs as well. Nice to get those on board as well.
John, I've got a question for you.
Sure.
On the Boeing 757 P2Fs,
Yeah.
Is there any preference for Pratt powered or Rolls powered?
What we've generally found is, by function of feedstock, is that if you take pure numbers, it's Rolls-Royce powered. But that's not to rule out the Pratt & Whitney powered. So just by virtue of the fact that the majority of the passenger fleet was Rolls powered, that's inherently kind of transitioned over to the available feedstock.
Yeah.
I've answered.
Thank you.
So moving on to the larger wide body fleets there. Again, that's the dominant players, of course, are the 747-400 in all its iterations, whether that's the factory freighter, the nose loader, the ERF nose loader, or of course the converted freighter, whether they're the Boeing aircraft, the BEDEC aircraft, etc. Although out of those 198 aircraft, it's definitely the factory freighters, the nose loaders, that fuel the majority of that demand. The 777 freighter, the factory freighter, 777 has come on very well. A substantial increase over last year, so lots of deliveries going there, and you've got new players like EVA Air coming in with them, and I think China Airlines of Taiwan have made either an MOU or certainly an intention to order that freighter. I've got old 3-engine friendly MD-11 down at the bottom there. Not much change since last year, really. That fleet's dominated obviously by FedEx, UPS, Lufthansa, and one or two other, or a few other smaller players. But the 3-engine aircraft kind of beginning to fall, or already falling out of favour a little bit there.
Another question for you, John.
Sure.
Is with the 747-8 freighter and the 777 freighter,
Yeah.
how far out do those backlogs go? Do you know what the order book's looking like? Is that going to be running for 5 years, 10 years? Any particular view on that?
I think in reality, you're probably looking, certainly out of the 5 or 10 years, I would say more like the 10 years for the 777F. The 747-8, the jury's out there a little bit on that, because of course, part of the ironic problem you've got is the 747-400F, particularly as a nose loader, has proven to be such a good aircraft in terms of its payload capability, that the 777F is just a little bit too small to directly replace it, and the 747-8F is either too big or very, very expensive in terms of new price. So the way we see it is we think that the nose loading 747-400F and ERF aircraft will actually continue for many, many years to come. But at some point they will require replacement. What that will long-term end up being, the jury's a little bit out there, but I think certainly of the two, the 747-8F and the 777F, the 777F probably has the likelihood of a longer-term backlog, based on it being an inherently, the airframe being an inherently younger design than that of the 747, and production levels and deliveries of the 777, there seems to be more market sentiment moving towards that aircraft type. It also serves probably as a better direct replacement to the MD-11, which at some point will require replacement.
Yeah, I mean, looking there, we've got almost 120 MD-11 freighters. We've got 10 of the older 747 freighters. So even the replacement of those over the next decade, let alone overall growth, means that this is still a fairly active market.
Correct.
Okay, sorry to hold you up. Let's progress.
No problem.
Okay.
So the next slide really is just a semi-repetition of the 2019 fleet over the 29 fleet, and really the idea there is to just show that the fleet has grown. What I've done is put only active aircraft to make it, I think it's a little bit more meaningful if you have only the active aircraft, because that shows the more true level of demand. And it's quite clear to see there that where the recent sort of last 12 months demand has really flowed. Obviously it's very welcome to have the 737, 700 and 800 converted freighters on board, which we didn't really have last year. A total of 18 between those two. You can see that the 757 fleet continues to grow, but look at how that 767-300 fleet has grown by around 60 units. That's not all through conversions, mind, because obviously FedEx is taking delivery of brand new 300s as we talk, really. Other aircraft that's done extremely well there in terms of bolstering up its fleet is the 777F. Like I said, we welcome new players like Eva Air Cargo to the 777F game, as it were. The geographical distribution, I'll kind of skim over that fairly rapidly. Suffice to say that it doesn't come as a great surprise that in the narrow body sector, the North American market really still kind of, I wouldn't say dominates it, but is certainly clearly the most populous region there, because you have players like FedEx and UPS with large 757 fleets, and in the mid sectors as well. The US is still very dominant, with people like Atlas, FedEx and so forth, UPS, etc., both with 767 and of course A300 fleets in there. And moving into the large sector, I guess that's partly skewered again with the North American market, partly skewered perhaps by people like UPS and FedEx with large MD-11 stroke 777 fleets there.
I suppose those are just holding up on there. Some of these colours do look very similar, but if you look across all three of these charts, it is that sort of dark green Asia Pacific area, which if we were to look back over the last 15 years, that has really taken now quite significant proportions. I think that's 24% on the narrow bodies, probably 15% I think on the mid-size, and over 20% on the wide bodies. So I suppose that is a sign of the importance of that region over the last 10 or 15 years, and we expect that to continue.
Very much so. Looking at the conversions here, freighter conversions, it's encouraging to see that 2018, so obviously those are annual conversions, January through to the end of December. They're based upon Boeing and Airbus products, which obviously predominate the conversions. I guess Boeing predominating that within the two sets. You're looking mid-80s, basically, the kind of range, depending on how you interpret the conversion, about 84 to 87 aircraft. And during that 2018 period, in terms of the symptoms of what was converted, there were still lots of 737, or the main contributors, if you like, to those 80-odd aircraft was actually 73 Classic. 734s were still converted in large quantity. And predictably enough, 757-200 in reasonable quantity, and a lot of 767-300 ER aircraft were converted. And yeah, moving on to the details of that conversion graph. Here's our kind of breakdown. We thought this was quite a revealing sort of set of analysis, actually, because what you see there is the breakdown of those 2018 conversions. And like I say, you can see where you've got the distinct dominance, or maybe that's a bit of a strong word, but certainly majority of conversions with 734s, 752s, and 763s. That's probably not too surprising. But what we thought was really revealing is if you take the price per conversion, and that conversion is just the conversion, it does not include additional maintenance and additional costs such as legal costs, having an on-site rep, etc. It's just the pure conversion cost. If you take the quantity times the conversion cost and add all that up, you're looking at basically a 600 or as near as damn it, a $650 million industry in 2018 alone in terms of pure conversions. And if you look at the percentages, it's interesting to note that the 767 accounts for about 60% the value of those conversions, and the 75 still account for nearly a fifth of that conversion in terms of conversion values. And it's important to stress as well that this is before you consider additional maintenance, non-routine items. And we think that actually that $650 million that we got there could probably edge on towards $1 billion by the time you consider those additional factors. So we thought that was quite a revealing set of figures, really.
Yeah, I think as we're going to see later when we do a bit of a case study, generally speaking, the best time to do the conversion is when it combines with a heavy check, a D check, or other significant checks. So it's inevitable that there will be other scheduled items that the facility will be performing on the aircraft, as well as other things that will be found in the course of stripping out passenger interiors. There's inevitably sort of corrosion and stress of other areas. I mean, a lot of that would be taken out anyway if there's floor beams and other structures being worked on. But yeah, again, just to emphasize, it's probably more like $1 billion industry annually, in my view.
So moving on, we thought we'd give you, having given you a framework of recent conversion trends and the recent fleet size, thought we'd give you a little idea as to how we see the transition or the growth from today's fleet to 5 years' time. At the moment, I mean, obviously we know that there is a number of players who are trying to launch and, very much involved in conversion programs for the A320 and the A321-200. But obviously in terms of an active fleet size, there's nothing flying at the moment. However, by 2024, 5 years out, we think it's very realistic to expect there to be a fairly, perhaps a junior fleet. When I mean junior, earlier on in the program of A320s and 321s, but of those two types, our general feel when we speak to lessors and people generally in the industry is that the 321 will probably be actually the more desirable of the two. So our forecast for the larger aircraft is a wee bit bigger, as you can see. 737-300 is a little bit of a decline. Believe it or not, they are still converting a few of those, not many, but a few. But I guess that fleet's getting pretty old now, so probably begin to see the numbers whittle down a bit there. 734s, we actually reckon you'll still see a little bit of growth because there are still a number of good aircraft out there, feedstock aircraft that still need to be converted. Yes, there is talk that there's not much feedstock left because the passenger fleet is now diminishing, but nevertheless there is stuff out there to be converted. So actually we still think you'll still get a little bit of growth in 734s. 737-700s, a fairly modest fleet. We see that as being perhaps a little bit kind of niche at the moment. It's only in service with a couple of operators. Hasn't really taken off to the same degree as its bigger cousin, the 737-800, which we think will flow healthily into over 100, easily over 100 units by 2024. Then, of course, our good old friend, the 757. Actually, we still think there probably will be a slightly bigger fleet in 2024, despite some retirements of earlier aircraft, simply because there are still some big fleets out there to convert. You've got some nice aircraft at the 2E grouping, American Airlines, Delta, etc. There are some nice aircraft out there, and we think they're still ripe for conversion. Moving on to the wide body, the mid-size wide body. Again, we've got some transitions going on there. The A300-600 freighter, okay, it's probably getting a little bit dated now, but actually it seems to have served its purpose very, very well indeed, and deserves positive appraise. It's served FedEx and UPS for many a year, and the other kind of relatively concentrated operator base that type has, but we think it's a very important and very good regional freighter actually, so we don't see too much decline in that model. I mean, at the end of the day, you're dropping about 10 units. That's hardly game changing, is it? The old B4F, we see that basically finished by then. The A310 is pretty nominal these days as well. That's basically finished by 2024. The A330-200 freighter, we like that aircraft, but sales, they've been a little bit sluggish. Based upon that premise, we've given quite a conservative number there at 47 units. But you can see the P2F versions of it, the ex-passenger aircraft. There are a lot of A330-200s and 300s due for replacement soon. We see some quite significant uptake for the passenger A330 conversions. A little bit of an erosion on the 767-200 freighter. I guess it's kind of been supplanted, if you like, by the 767-300. And of course, our good old friend, the DC-10, the MD-10s at the bottom there, very much dependent on what FedEx did with them, really, but they seem to soldier on forever.
You've got quite a few good old friends here today, haven't you, John? I think they're going to get very emotional about these freighters. One thing, actually, one of the questions we had early on was what was our view on the A330-200 P2F sector and how that's growing. So the answer is actually up there. We see, over the next 5 years, nearly 40 units going through conversion.
That kind of, and bear in mind that is only over a 5-year period. These we're talking about long-term periods here. So obviously with the forecast going out if you took that over 20 years, I haven't got the figures in front of me, but the figures speak for themselves. It's obvious that you're going to get a growing fleet of those A330, 200 and 300 P2Fs, and certainly the impression we get is it will make a very good sort of medium to high capacity regional freighter.
Is there any preference there for engine type? Because obviously there's
well, later on in the slide deck, we give a little summary anyway of the two versions, what's in service so far. But basically, I mean, it's not really representative enough yet, but the 200s, those two aircraft are Rolls powered, and the 300s, they're all Pratt powered. Okay. So yeah, but that, to be honest, Phil, that's not really, you know, I accept that's not really representative based upon that small figure. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Next.
So moving on to the high capacity wide bodies. Yeah, it's an interesting one, this, because the 747-400s, a little bit of a reduction there, but I think that's probably going to be more the converted freighters reducing rather than the nose cargo aircraft. You know, we really do see continued demand for those. They occupy a very important part of the market as a no-nonsense high capacity freighter. We do see continued in terms of the growth of that fleet. We see the majority of it coming from new deliveries of 747-8Fs and 777Fs. Then, of course, we put in red here the 777-200ERs and the 300ER P2Fs. At the moment, it's not known exactly what the status of, you know, launch status of those potential programs. But you'd certainly want to consider, while not committing, you'd certainly want to consider putting those into your potential forecast. And if they do go ahead, and on the assumption that they do go ahead with both of those products, we see the 200ER P2F entering service around the period kind of 2022-ish. I'm not going to give a precise month or anything like that, but that kind of time frame, and then a little bit later for the 300ER, because obviously you've got to wait for the feedstock values to come down on those a bit. A little bit of a decline on the MD-11 there as the 3-engine aircraft go out of favour, basically. But for all three sectors, I think the important thing is to show that, you know, we definitely think there's quite positive growth in terms of the population of all three sectors.
Sorry, you may have answered this. I know you're talking about some months there. The 777-300ER.
Yeah.
But obviously we've seen some distress in certain regions of the world.
Yeah.
Maybe some aircraft will be coming up for availability. And how close is that program for the 300 conversion?
Well, our projections are that if they go ahead and do it, I mean, if you look at basically in terms of past history, normally a P2F, in terms of the aircraft rolling out of the factory, it normally occurs when the aircraft program is about 18, 19 years old. So we think realistically, if they do it in terms of rolling out of the, you know, out of the MRO and actually emerging into test flying as a fully converted aircraft, you probably are looking at around the period 2023 to 2024. Okay. Despite the fact that you've got some lease ends, it's well known that there's plenty of lease ends coming up with Emirates, not in Emirates, but, you know, Cathay, they're taking a lot of A350,000s now, Qatar are taking A350,000s, etc. But there doesn't seem to be a great rush at the moment for the passenger operators to be getting rid of their 300ERs. So
I was just thinking that in there's some, obviously some, let's say, Jet Airways aircraft coming up as being available, but they're kind of just too young. The program's not there yet.
The program's not there yet, and we do see them being snapped up by, you know, if you look at the trends of where other 777s have been placed. I know the ex-Kenya ones, I think they went to Turkish in the end, didn't they? Or they certainly put them on lease to Turkish. Some ex-Emirates ones went into Russia. So, you know, that there are still the kind of emerging markets, if you like, for some of the 300 ER slack.
Okay.
So moving on to, after all, we are in certainly a big chunk of our business is the appraisal business. I thought no kind of deck would be complete without a little bit of values and lease rates and opinion thereof. Yeah, basically these numbers, I suppose in an ideal world, really for the values, we should put a range there, because depending on who you speak to, 737-400s, they're a good case in point. Some people will tell you they're worth about 7.5 million. Other people tell you that they're worth about 11 million. We think the kind of 8 to 9 million, we're at 8.8 there for argument's sake. These are very much indicative numbers. But these are kind of, are sort of indicative numbers as to where we think the converted aircraft should be, so post-conversion. And the associated lease rate. Obviously the lease rate, some of them we give a range where you get more transaction points and where you've got larger fleets. Others we stick with a kind of single digit figure really. But hopefully those give you, based upon the feedback we get, hopefully those sort of quantums give you an idea as to where we think the numbers should lie on those.
On the conversion costs, just to clarify, you said there it excludes the check costs and all those other items that we mentioned earlier. Do you know roughly what the proportion is for that in terms of the materials and then the manpower? I mean, does the basic kit, is it kind of 60 or 70% of that and the rest is labour? Is there any general guide, or is that something, have I asked myself a really difficult question there? Yeah. Excellent. I think the answer is in the order of 70% of that is materials, but I'll wait for the responses to come flooding in from those out there listening who may have a better idea.
So what we did here, moving on, was we came up with a sort of scenario, if you like. If you had, and we thought the 737-800 would be a good sort of guinea pig, if you like, or mule, whatever you want to call it, to do a case study. And we thought, well, your typical conversion candidate would probably be about a 19-year-old 737-800, so I guess about a 2000 year of build. And this first page gives you an idea of what we think roughly the maintenance condition of that aircraft would be. And then what we decided we'd do is to look at the options as to whether you continue to lease the aircraft out as a passenger aeroplane or convert it to freighter, and what happens further down the line. So the first option is if you sold the aircraft today, basically as a naked off-lease aircraft, adjusted for that maintenance condition, we reckon a 2000 delivered 737-800 would be worth about 11.3 million. As a part out of the passenger aeroplane, about 6.5 million. And that's basically, that's what we reckon a part out specialist would pay you for the aircraft. And then obviously over time, some more money would be reaped back from that. But as a kind of spot price as to what they would pay you, we reckon around 6.5 million. If you continued with the aircraft for another 6 years on a typical sort of 6-year lease, at a fairly, I suppose it's quite a keen lease rate, $165,000 a month, and a residual value at the end of that. Our assumption is you're probably looking at about a $7 million residual. And if you parted the aircraft out once it's 25 years old, we reckon the teardown value would decrease to about 3.6 million. So in effect, if you then did a conversion to the cargo, we believe your feedstock value would be just over the 11 million mark, 11.3 million. Obviously that can vary a little bit depending on the age and the spec of the aircraft, but we think about 11-ish million for your PAX feedstock. an estimated conversion cost of about 4 million for an 800, but then there are the additional costs, maintenance, the ferry flight, the management, having an on-site rep, legal costs, as Phil mentioned earlier, non-routine maintenance, having to do maintenance work, etc. So we reckon by the time you've added all those sort of on a mathematical basis, you're kind of into the converted aircraft for just nigh on 18.5 million or 18,450,000. So looking at the options, kind of summarizing those options, you can see there that in terms of potential revenue, from a pure sale point of view, you're looking at the kind of 11.3 millions areas for the passenger aeroplane. If you tore it down today, the mid sixes. If you converted it to freighter, again, you'd be looking at about 11.3 million once you've considered the conversion cost and those legal fees, and having a site on rep, etc. But if you then take out at the 25-year point, so that's leasing the aircraft for another 6 years as a passenger aircraft with a teardown value of 3.6 million. We reckon in terms of lease rentals revenue, you're probably looking at nigh on $12 million worth of rentals there. You end up with a figure of about $15.5 million. However, if you convert to freighter, so basically convert it to freighter and then take it all the way out on several leases out to the point where it becomes 37 years old, you're basically looking, by the time you consider your conversion costs, your lease rentals as a converted freighter, because you ought to get higher rentals as a converted freighter, that figure increases quite drastically to nearly $25 million. And even if you part the freighter out at the end of the period, you're still looking at nigh on $24 million. So whichever way you look at it, there is quite a sort of attractive flow of money there, if you like, or investment in the freighter P2F option. Talking of 737-800 BCS SS, we thought it would just be interesting to show you where we're at with the active fleet as of today. Our database shows that there are those 13 aircraft physically in service. And what's quite interesting actually is, generally speaking, yes, they're higher gross weight aircraft, but they're not all up at 174 too. There's a number of them, if anything, more than 172.5 takeoff weight. There's also a light gross aircraft there. What's really interesting though is 2002 actually seems to be a nucleus date in terms of the delivery. And as you can see, I put in who they were before when they were the passenger, so you can kind of see where they sourced those aircraft from. And by CZ, I mean China Southern. So you can see quite clearly that the majority of that fleet has come from China Southern and through GCAS as the owner of those aircraft, showing a strong lessor and in particular GCAS degree of ownership in that. The other thing is, we're told, again, we're fairly confident in this, but we're told that basically the aircraft do have to feature winglets for the conversions. And then looking at the other operators, the Air Algérie aircraft was sourced from within their own fleet, hence I put Self, and a couple of Knock Air and Travel Service aircraft there as well. And we thought, having done that for the 800, we'd give you a quick rundown on the 700, which is basically most of them were Alaskan aircraft converted for use by Alaska themselves, although we saw some Sherman aircraft as well, which are now with SpiceJet.
I just wondered there, John, I think what we've seen is a lot of the older 700s have really gone down the part out route, yes, rather than conversion.
Yes.
Because the value of those parts across the broader fleet is kind of perhaps easy. I don't say easy money, but in terms of liquid, it doesn't need that reinvestment. So I think that is quite a niche. Have you got any views on whether we're expecting to see more 700s being converted?
I think there will be more 700s being converted, but what you've got to look out for is there are some big fleets. I mean, the irony of it is, you know, you can't really mention the word 700 without mentioning Southwest Airlines, who have well over 500, so they've basically got half the fleet, give or take a few units. But we've heard that it's a kind of funny irony with Southwest. On the one hand, they were taking loads of used examples over the last few years from a number of different airline sources. Though, you know, they could be ex-Aeromexico, they could be ex-WestJet ones. They're all over the shop. Some coming out of China. But now Southwest are talking about retiring some of their 700s. Now, whether that's some of the used ones they got, or whether that's some of their early deliveries from 1997, 1998, I just don't know yet. And of course, with 30 odd Maxes grounded now with Southwest, if they, you know, delay that retirement a little bit, who's to know what's going to happen? So, but if it's early Southwest aircraft, all of the same takeoff weight, and therefore likely to have similar records and so forth, then you've got kind of like sister ships you can work off. Yeah. The other one, of course, we know that at some point fairly soon, I mean, when I say fairly soon, between now and 2023 is SAS have ordered a big fleet of NEOs, and they will replace the 737s, 700s and 800s. Well, I would have thought at SAS you're going to have quite a nice fleet of, I suppose, quite high cycle, when they've been flying within Scandinavia, but certainly in terms of records, similar record aircraft operating in a benign environment, similar spec. So let's wait and see. There might be you know, prospects there for those aircraft, but I do believe there are some more aircraft sitting at BEDEC at the moment actually that have come from I'd have to check where the source is, but one of our data guys noticed there are a number of 700s actually sitting at BEDEC at the moment. So people are obviously sourcing them and, you know, using them as well.
Okay.
So, having talked about the Boeing aircraft, I thought it was interesting to touch on where we are with the A330, 200 and 300 P2Fs, because obviously it's great to welcome these new types on board. We do think there's real future in this, and I think it's a start of a new era actually, and I think it should be looked at with great positivity. So as you can see there, they're basically, I believe they're doing the DHL contracts, but the European Air Transport and the Air Hong Kong aircraft. I think there's two Air Hong Kong aircraft are mainly flying routes such as like Penang and Hong Kong and that kind of area of Asia, whereas obviously the European Air Transport aircraft is or will be operating within the European area. As you can see, the gross takeoff weights on those 300s are quite low, suggesting that the values are probably still a wee bit high on the 230 ton or 233 ton aircraft. But one trend that you do see there is that they're all Pratt powered, those early ones. And of course, Egypt Air Cargos, they're self-converted. When I mean that is they source the aircraft from within their own fleet, and I believe they're kind of supplementing and eventually replacing the A300, 600s within the Egypt Air fleet, and they're Rolls powered. They're also quite young, those aircraft actually, but clearly Egypt Air have a model where they've seen suitability to convert those aircraft, and they are now successfully in service. So certainly it's good to see those aircraft in service, and we do expect that list to get longer and longer as the years progress. One thing that's been a little bit quiet of recent has been what's actually been going on with the C-cubed A320 and 321 P2F programs. I think we've heard a little bit more on the Valair and the Precision programs. We haven't really heard much on the C3, or sorry, the C-cubed program. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of an update on that, just to see what we've heard anyway. So yeah, basically they've been working on the 320 and the 321 in tandem for about 3 years now. We're told that they're actually going to induct the 320 first, so that if they do find any snags in that, they can iron those out before moving into the what is more likely to be the more popular 321. The A320 guinea pig, or whatever you want to call it, test aircraft, we understand is roughly a month away from induction, i.e. going into the facility, and a launch is projected for late summer 2020. At least that's what we're informed. The aim is that the 321 prototype should follow suit a little bit later than that. We were told again, kind of end 2020, late 2020, however you want to interpret that. Still not seen too much in the way of detailed design work on either of the programs. But what we are told is one of their major selling points anyway, is that the designs are virtually identical, and that they have their door in the same location, regardless of whether you put that on a 320 or a 321, and that the clearance crucially ahead of those engines is good or is sound, because the last thing you want obviously is loading equipment, getting too close to your engines and scraping the heads of the nacelles or anything, or the leading edges, which would not be very desirable. In terms of commonality, we're informed that it's roughly 90% across the two programs in terms of the conversion, and that's obviously of real benefit for the MROs and operators, as it simplifies procedures and loading equipment. So when you're at the airport, you don't need different loading equipment for the 320 versus the 321. The 9G barrier, we're told, is going to be a little bit beefier, for want of a better word, for the A321 than the 320, but then I guess you'd probably expect that if you're hauling more cargo behind. What we found really interesting, and in terms of like an investor point of view, is that so we're informed that the C3 conversion applies to both IAE and CFM powered aircraft, and that includes A1, so the early V2500 A1, and the CFM 56 5A1 5A3 powered aircraft. To be honest, I can't really see that many, certainly not early V aircraft, being converted, because the remaining fleet's so nominal anyway, and the 5A powered fleet is generally pretty aging now, apart from the remaining fleet at Delta, which is still quite young. Well, they've got some pretty old ones actually, because they're ex-Northwest, but there are also still some quite young ones there. But generally speaking, we think it's going to be the later iterations of both the Vs and the CFM powered aircraft. They apparently even could do a Neo, but of course that's miles away realistically. The Neo is extremely successful as a passenger aircraft, so obviously that's a long way off, so let's just not even go down that route yet. The other thing is the P2F that they propose apparently applies to all weights, but not to the A321-100, but it does apply to all weights of A321-200 as well as A320-200, and it applies to sharklet as well as wingtip fenced aircraft. Our understanding is that the cost of the A320 will be broadly similar to that of a 738. What kind of variation is too early days, but broadly similar. We'll leave it at that. And at the 321 will be 800,000, so I guess nigh on $1 million more, which to us at IBA sounds about right. The expectation on payload is that the A320, which I guess is predictable enough, will lie somewhere between a 734 and a 738, which is what you'd expect, because an A320 is slightly longer than a 734, but slightly shorter than a 738. And predictably enough, the 321 would fall just below the 757 at about 28 tons or 62,000 pounds. That's based upon what we're informed anyway. So I thought just give you a little bit of an update on that. Certainly found that quite interesting, that bit of research. So we thought we'd treat you to that update. Before we take questions and round up, I think we're getting to the sort of concluding statements, which basically most 737 and 300 and 400 conversions have now occurred, and it's time to move over to a small number of 700s, but plenty of 800s over the next few years. from a market perspective, over the next 20 years, we can see as many as 775 conversions, and predictably enough, most of those will come from 737 NG, 757-200 still in the Airbus A320, A321. And the bulk of the conversions in the mid-size sector, A330-200s and 300s, but there are still some quite substantial 767-300ER fleets out there. So still plenty of opportunity there. Of course, the wide body, or the big heavy wide body sector, it really, you know, what happens to the Boeing 777 P2F program, on the assumption that one occurs and goes ahead, that will obviously have a major play on how that sort of, in terms of the symptoms or the components of that fleet, pans out over the next 20 years. But we see around 300 aircraft being converted, or maybe slightly more than that, over the next 20 years. So the final statement, we thought, which was, you know, despite some falling yields and revenues recently, we thought the webinar shouldn't be complete without mention of VX Capital, which launched a successful all freighter ABS in late 2018, basically very centric on around 35 737 classic freighters, with the 400s accounting for the majority of that portfolio. So despite a fairly mature, well, a pretty mature fleet going on there, with those 35 classic freighters, there clearly is confidence in the longevity of that program. So I think that's quite an encouraging sort of piece of news to wrap up on.
And I mean, just to add to that, I mean, typically, you know, ABS structures in aircraft leasing and other sectors for that matter, they tend to rely on a very broad portfolio, many different types, many different operators. So I think it just shows the appetite from investors in this sector was still very strong, and I don't expect it to be the last of sort of an all freighter ABS structure. So
okay. All right, well, thank you John, and thank you Phil. That is the end of the more formal part of today's update. We hope you found that very useful and insightful. We've got quite a few questions that have come through. While we just pull those questions up and take a very brief look at those, I'd like to mention that the data used in today's session is from IBA IQ, our online intelligence platform. If you've not already taken a look at the systems, we have various models. We have the fleet values and trends modules. We are offering free trials, so do get in touch through our website, where you can register online if you would like to have a look around the system. Okay, as I said, we've got quite a few questions. Phil, do you want to start?
I've just been going through those. We've actually had quite a lot of questions and also some very helpful statements from some of the participants. There's almost 100 of you listening out there, just to let you know. I was asked, you know, how many are on this, so I think in terms of registrants, we had over a couple of hundred.
Yeah, we had 350 people registered, and we've got over 100 people listening today.
Yeah. As far as some of these questions, we will get back to each and every one of you. I've picked out a few which I think we can answer fairly rapidly. One of the, I suppose, I was going to say the elephant in the room, or rather the elephant that's not in the room, particularly in the conversion space, is the A340.
Yeah.
You know, there's all these Boeing conversions for the extra large wide bodies, but you know, there's potentially plenty of A340s at relatively low values that could be used. There just doesn't seem to be the OEM engagement there. We have seen some, I think, what's it called, the low cost freighter or something? Yeah,
the A340 is quite a fascinating one, because obviously you've got two families, if you like, because obviously you've got the, well, let's dismiss the 200 because that's now literally down to VIP, you know, a few aircrafters, but the 300 and the 5/600, again, the 500 really, that's been pretty well relegated. I think there's one left with Azerbaijan, but the 600 fleet has depleted quite rapidly, actually. Qatar Airways recently getting out of it, Etihad a year or so ago, Virgin finishes this year. And unfortunately, there's not been much of a used market for A340-600. Yes, some of them went to Iran, but only a very, very small number went to Iran. Unfortunately, a lot have kind of gone on a one-way ticket to places like Tarbes, where they will be parted out. So yeah, there doesn't really seem to be much kind of push for an A340-600 conversion, and neither does there seem to be much of a push for an A340-300 conversion, which again, the fleet is now down to roughly half the original fleet, still operational and declining rapidly. And again, perhaps sad to say, most of the A340-300 fleet, they come out of Philippine Airlines recently, and Iberia. Well, Iberia is a few years ago now, but to give you just examples, generally speaking, it seems to be the teardown, the long-term storage and teardown market, which is in many ways a shame, because I guess in theory it would, in terms of a good value freighter, the feedstock, as Phil rightly says, could probably be acquired for a fraction of the cost of a triple. And even if you don't do the full freighter conversion, you go for one of these sort of lower cost type freight conversions, the theory is that you could probably have a very effective freighter, but there just doesn't seem to be the pull, if you like, whether it's a market pull, or there just doesn't seem to be that motivation, if you like, to push that program forward, meaning, you have a rapidly depleting fleet.
Now, I mean, here's a question which, of course, I think actually we should be charging to answer this question, Jono. It says, if you had $1 billion to invest in this space, would you convert wide bodies or narrow bodies, or could you be even more specific? Exactly what type would you go for? I was going to answer on your behalf, actually, Jono.
Sure.
So I think actually you'd buy all your good friends back, wouldn't you? You'd buy all those really old DC-10s.
Lockheed TriStar,
yeah,
707,
I think
DC-9.
You spend money on all of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, have you got any thoughts on that? Would you go 7.6s? Would you go 7.38s?
Yeah, I think in terms of a sensible balance, and looking at it long term, I still got faith in the 737-400s. I think they're still here for a long time yet. It's kind of found a second nature as a P2F freighter.
I'm sure those ABS investors are happy with that statement.
Yeah, 737-800, that's a given. It's obvious that seems to be the new kind of, let's have one of those moving forward. But the A321, we hear a lot of positivity moving forward. But basically with the A321, it's not out there and physically in service yet, so it's difficult to kind of give feedback on any operational experience of that aeroplane as a freighter, but on the assumption that it does achieve its payload capability that's advertised, it has to be argued surely that as an eventual supplement and perhaps replacement to 757s, you can fly a route so much cheaper with much cheaper operating costs and fuel burn costs on an A321. So I think longer term, you'd be crazy to kind of overlook the A321 as well. Wide bodies, I think, at the moment, the 767-300ER is still a pretty solid investment, and I think there's still a long-term future in that. And of course, the A330-2 and 300s. Of the two A330s, I think probably the A330-300 is probably a longer-term prospect of the two. Yeah. More engine choices. Well, obviously you can have Pratt GE and Rolls on all three. But a larger fleet on the 300 and a lot of lower gross weight aircraft to choose from, meaning you're going to get more attractive feedstock.
So you'd invest in everything by the sounds of that, then? Yeah? You'd spread your portfolio. Excellent.
Play the PC game here a bit.
That's probably a good idea. And I think we've just got one question here. We've been asked, has the MAX issue impacted the 737-8 conversion program? I assume that means, would there be fewer candidates in the next few years? Have you got any view on that?
I think, Obviously, the 737-800 fleet has been very, very busy as we approach our summer, and I think it seems quite clear that certainly in Europe and the Asian peak summer season, the US peak summer seasons, the 800 fleet is going to be kept as busy as ever. But I think on a long-term basis, you have to, don't like using the word assume because you're not being, but you have to take the premise that the 737 MAX, it is going to get fixed. They're kind of committed to that with a backlog of over 4,000 aircraft and a grounded fleet roughly approaching, give or take, 400 aircraft. It's going to get fixed, and therefore what you're seeing is a fairly short-term extension and business of the 800 fleet. But I think long-term, it's not going to affect feedstock.
Okay, thanks for that. I will just say we have had a lot more questions, and as I said, we will get back to each one of you with some specific points there. So thanks for your participation. Over to you, Mel.
Okay, yeah, well, I was just going to say that apologies for not getting to all the questions. We have run out of time, but as Phil says, we'll drop you a line separately to try and address those. So I just leaves me to say thank you to Phil and Jono, and thank you everyone for attending today's session. A few kind of notices. We've got 2 webinars coming up. Phil and Stu Hatcher will be discussing the orders and announcements from the Paris Air Show and what that might mean for the markets. That's happening on the 25th of June. We will send you the link if that's something you'd like to listen in for. We're also will be doing a session on repossessions. There's lots of S's in that. That will be happening in July, so do look out for that one as well. So on behalf of IBA, Phil and Jono and myself, thank you for joining us today. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.